Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem.
This is Sheviis chapter 10, Halacha 3. This is part 2 of the shiur. And if you're following along in the art scroll, it's 8681. So, yesterday we were looking at post-dated documents for loans. And one of the worries about post-dated documents would be, what about forgery? And the argument that Rabbi Yossi is putting forward was that post-dated documents could be forged. And a document is always going to be assumed to be valid because you have witnesses. But now, if you have a post-dated document that was not necessarily examined by a court, and then they're putting in a new date, perhaps forgery can come in. And this is important because this is not a debt. The Prozbul is not just a debt. This is something that is submitted over to the bet din for them to go and collect. So we're always worried about authentic documents and making sure that people can't cheat. And so that's why the halacha is going to be shaped like that. Now the Gemara is going to talk about the next section of the Mishnah, and that's going to be where a Prozbul is going to be written only on the basis of land owned by the borrower. We were talking before in chapter 10 that if you have a Prozbul, and let's say they are putting it to land in general. So let's say Mr. X has lots of land, and then all of a sudden the Prozbul goes and ties it to land in general. Okay, this value of this loan shall be tied to X value of land that Mr. X owns, and then they put it into the court. The court's going to look at that and say, well, this is not a valid Prozbul because it has to be tied to a specific parcel of land. So the Gemara is now going to talk about the Mishnah's requirement of owning land in order to execute a Prozbul. Rav says that this requirement is filled only when both the lender and the borrower have land. The idea is that the lender also has to own land so that if the borrower were to sell his real property, the lender could transfer some of the land to him to maintain his eligibility for Prozbul. According to Rav, says Rosh Hashanah, the Mishnah, which requires only the borrower to have land, apparently follows a minority opinion. So that's an interesting point. In other words, that the lender also has to own land, according to Rav. But Rabbi Yochanan says it is sufficient if the lender has land even though the borrower does not have land, or if the borrower has land even though the lender does not have land. Now that last one is surprising, and the implication, says Pnei Moshe of the Mishnah, is that it's enough if one of them owns property. This is very, very lenient. So the Gemara is going to cite a brisa that teaches another law regarding the need for land. If the borrower does not have land, but those obligated to him have land, we write a Prozbul for his loans. And the idea is going to get discussed coming up, so that the Gemara is going to elaborate on the ruling that if the borrower has no loan, the lender may transfer to him a small amount of land for the Prozbul to be effective. So let's say he wants to borrow money, but he doesn't have any land. And the idea that Rav is basically putting out there that the lender has to own land. Why? Because he can then transfer a small piece of the land over to the lender, and then the lender will have a small piece of land and can take out the loan. By the way, this can be a tiny amount of land. We saw a Gemara in Peah where somebody transferred over a tefach of land. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny spot of land, a few inches by a few inches, and he was able to do things legally with regards to movable property on inheritance for a piece of land that was actually owned, and the halacha is going to be a little bit different if movables are going to be on property you own or tied to property you own. So over here, when you're talking about transferring a piece of land, it can be a tiny piece of land. It can be a few inches by a few inches. Rabbi Ba says in the name of Rav, regarding someone who has only a stalk of cabbage in another field, we may write a Prozbul for him. In other words, you can transfer the ownership of this tiny plot of land that this stalk of cabbage is growing on it. That's going to be enough to write a Prozbul. Why is this in here? Well, this is in here because we are trying to establish how much land do you need, and it turns out to be very, very small. Gemara is going to ask a question, and there's a brisa that taught that partners, sharecroppers, and guardians have no Prozbul. That's a surprising chiddush. In other words, that a Prozbul cannot be written on the basis of their ownership or the management of property. That's interesting because a partner in a partnership that owns a piece of land does not own a specific parcel of land. And you can't point to this piece of area here and say, oh, this is mine in the partnership. No, partnership owns interest in the land, and they own that together, but you can't point to a specific parcel. It's not like going and pointing out to that stalk of cabbage that Rav is talking about, where, oh, you see this tiny piece of land, this is mine, this cabbage is growing out of it, it's a tefach by a tefach, that's my piece of land. That's going to be different. What about a sharecropper? A sharecropper just has a profit-sharing arrangement with the owner of the field. And the issue about a guardian for an orphan, he doesn't necessarily have, the orphans don't own the land at all. So a Prozbul cannot be executed for loans to these kinds of borrowers unless they had land of their own. So if the ownership of a single stalk of cabbage is going to be enough for a Prozbul to be effective, so then why is it that a Prozbul may not be written in the case of a partner who actually owns an interest in a very large share of a field, in a very large field? Gemara answers. They said there each and every stalk is owned in partnership, and the borrower owns nothing on his own. However, here the stalk is totally his. In other words, that this little spot of land where the stalk of cabbage is coming out of it, he actually owns interest, all the economic interest in it. The interest in it, that's his piece of earth here. The other is just a partnership. That's why a Prozbul can be written. Pnei Moshe, his insight about this is like this. He says, although each partner has rights to the entire property, nevertheless, a partnership has the disadvantage that neither party independently owns any property. So it's unlike a case of a borrower who exclusively owns a stalk of cabbage. So this is the conclusion of the Yerushalmi, that land owned in partnership is not valid for Prozbul. But that is not cited by the Rambam or the Shulchan Aruch. Just want to point that out. But this is the opinion of the Yerushalmi. The Gemara now is going to ask about another case. What is the law with regard to writing a Prozbul for loans taken out by a guardian on the basis of property for an orphan? And this is going to be where the guardian's now going to borrow money from his personal needs, and he did not own any land. And that issue is going to be whether this Prozbul, says Pnei Moshe, can be written on the basis of the land he is managing on behalf of the orphans. So, this inquiry is necessary, says Pnei Moshe, because for this very issue, whether a Prozbul may be written for loans taken out by a guardian on the basis of the property of the orphans. In other words, the orphans own the land, and this guy's the guardian. Question here is going to be, can the guardian come and use the land of the orphans to take out a Prozbul for the guardian, or even for the orphans? So this this brisa, which is teaching that a Prozbul may not be written for a loan made to guardians, is based on the property of the orphans. And the Beur halacha in the Shara Muna is going to explain that there's no proof that may be drawn from that brisa, because the brisa may follow the view of the rabbis who maintain that a Prozbul may not be written for loan to orphans based on the land owned by the guardian. And that, by the way, is going to be in dispute with Rabbi Chutzpis of this Mishnah. So here, the Gemara is basically asking whether, according to Rabbi Chutzpis, who's quoted in this Mishnah, who maintains that a Prozbul may be written for loan to the orphans based on land owned by the guardian. And actually, the opposite is going to be true. So this does not necessarily follow the ruling of Rabbi Chutzpis in this Mishnah, and we can see that in actuality, the reverse is going to be true in the sugya here. In the Mishnah over here, Rabbi Chutzpis is ruling that with regards to land owned by a guardian who is responsible for orphans' care, his reasoning would not necessarily be applicable in the Gemara's case, where the orphans are in not any way responsible for the guardian. So, in the opinion of Rabbi Chutzpis in this Mishnah, he's holding that a Prozbul may not be written for loan to orphans based on land owned by the guardian. But here the Gemara is asking whether, according to Rabbi Chutzpis, who maintains that Prozbul may be written for loan to the orphans based on land owned by the guardian. So again, it's going to go by the rabbis here. The rabbis are basically disputing the opinion of Rabbi Chutzpis, and they're holding that you actually that a Prozbul is not allowed to be written for a loan to orphans based on land owned by the guardian. So guardian owns the land. Orphans are sitting there, they don't own land. And can the guardian assign some land to take out a Prozbul on behalf of the guardians? The rabbis are saying no. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, let us learn the answer from the following rule in the Mishnah, and we may write a Prozbul for loans taken out by a man based on the property of his wife. It's a very similar case. So over here, a husband is equivalent to a guardian over the wife's property. And since the Mishnah states that one may write a Prozbul for a husband based on his wife's property, Prozbul may be written for a guardian based on the property of the orphans. So generally, when a woman gets married, her property is going to be divided into two categories. One is going to be the melod property, which is going to be what the wife retains. It's the actual ownership of the property, while the husband is allowed to enjoy rights of the produce. If the marriage is terminated, she resumes complete ownership of the property as it is, whether the property went up or went down. And any property that the women received during marriage, like an inheritance or a gift, are going to fall to that category. Then you have the other kind, which is a san barzal property, which is going to be appraised at the time of marriage and transferred immediately to the husband assuming full responsibility for the return of the full assessed value of the property. Now, the idea here is that the Mishnah is teaching that a Prozbul may be written for a husband where the woman has melod property. Although the grounds for writing a Prozbul of one's wife's melod property is on the basis of the husband's right to the produce, over here, a guardian does not have benefit from the land of the guardians. So the Gemara is drawing a comparison between the two, but the difference is that the guardian doesn't get benefit, is not allowed to have benefit from the property of the orphans. But the husband, if the wife comes in with melod property, and melod property goes and grows produce that is assessed at X value, the husband's allowed to do business with it or to use it or to benefit from it. So the Gemara is going to try to dig into this a little bit deeper, and it asks a question. It says, what is the law with regard to writing a Prozbul for loans taken out by a woman on the basis of the property of her husband. This is actually going to be very similar. So the idea is that the women go and borrow money. It's going to be for her own use. And she goes and she points it to the property of the husband and puts that into the Prozbul. Is that going to be a valid Prozbul? When they hand that over to the court, is the court going to say, oh, this is a valid Prozbul, let me go collect off the husband's property if something goes wrong? The Gemara is going to answer. It says, let us learn the answer from this other case in the Mishnah. And it says, and similarly, a Prozbul may be written for loans of orphans based on the property of their guardians. And the case is going to be similar to the writing of a Prozbul for a woman based on her husband's property. Why? The husband is regarded as a guardian over the wife's melech property. So, in this case, the woman obviously doesn't have melech property, which is why she's relying on the husband's property. But it can be a fact that if she were to own property, her husband would be the guardian. And basically, it's going to give him the status of a guardian. So accordingly, the Gemara is going to be speaking of a case where she owned movable property that has not yet been converted to land. So if you have a Prozbul, it could be written for orphans based on the property of their guardian, and a Prozbul likewise may be written for a wife based on her husband's property. This is another case where you have a questionable association to land, but it's going to be recognized by the rabbis because the Prozbul requirement is only going to be rabbinic. So the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to address the next section in the Mishnah, and it's going to talk about the beehive. And over here, Rabbi Lazar is saying that it's like land, and a Prozbul may be written on its basis, and it is not susceptible to tumah in its place, and one who detaches honey from it on Shabbat is liable. The sages say it is not like land, and a Prozbul may not be written on the basis of a beehive. It is susceptible to tumah in its place. That, by the way, is going to be like a utensil. The sages are going to be looking at the beehive like a utensil, and they're going to say that one who detaches honey from it is not liable. So big difference over here. So over here, Rabbi Lazar is basically going to be treating the detaching, which is one of the malachas on Shabbat, going to be similar to like if you have a palm tree and you have a cluster of dates and you break off the cluster of dates from the palm tree. It's going to be similar to that. The sages are going to be saying, no, it's really like a utensil, and you're really taking something out of a utensil, and that's not going to be forbidden. It's not like detaching. Rabbi Abahu says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, the source for Rabbi Lazar is considered where you have the beehive, where it's going to be like land, and that's going to be based on the following verse. This is going to be in 1 Samuel 14:26. This is a story where Shaul HaMelech is getting ready for battle against the Philistines, and he is saying that his men will not eat food until the evening. And Shaul HaMelech's son, Yonatan, however, has not heard the king's declaration, and when he came upon a field that was oozing with honey, he dipped his staff into some of the honey and ate it. So the verse that Rabbi Lazar is hanging his hat on, so to speak, is that it says the people came to the forest, and behold, there was an oozing of honey. Now, the Gemara is going to look at that, and it's going to say, how do you learn this from the verse? Very good question. And the Gemara is going to explain it. Rabbi Mana to the rescue. Rabbi Mana comes and says, does a forest produce honey? Of course not. Rather, this verse is teaching that honey in a beehive is considered like land, like a forest. And so, since a verse cannot mean that the honey was actually grown out of the forest, it's meaning that the honey is compared to like a forest. They're both going to be land. And the Gemara is going to conclude to say, but had Rish Lakish stated the next verse, and he dipped it into the forest of honey, it would have been better. In other words, the first verse can be understood merely to mean that the honey was oozing along the face of the field. The second verse, however, is it's going to be harder to understand because there's no such thing as a forest of honey. So the verse must be teaching that honey in a beehive is considered attached to the land like a forest, like how a forest is attached to the land. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to give another source, and it's going to say an Amara, who indeed quotes Rish Lakish as giving a second verse for this source. What they're trying to figure out, I mean, obviously Rish Lakish is not taking the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. He's merely trying to understand the source of where is Rabbi Eliezer getting this from. That's what they're trying to figure out. None of these people are ruling this way. They're just trying to understand where is he getting from. So the Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Bun, says the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Learn it like this. It says, and he dipped it into the forest of honey. And this is basically going to be teaching that both the beehive and the honey in it are considered attached to the land. And someone who removes honey from a beehive on Shabbat is going to be liable for detaching something that is growing in the ground, where it's like reaping. And therefore, since the hive has the status like land, it is acquired with the same acts of acquisition that apply to land. And so Prozbul can be written based on the ownership of a hive. The hive is not subject to the utensil tuma. That's basically what's going on. So basically, Rish Lakish is looking at this verse that Rabbi Eliezer is coming up with, and he's basically saying that if you're detaching some of the honey from the hive, it's like you've detached other produce from its source, like the palm tree, or you detached a stalk of wheat, or you detached a cluster of grapes. So, or you plucked some grapes off of a cluster. That would be a better example. So the Gemara is going to analyze the dispute in the Mishnah, and it's going to ask, what are we dealing with? If we're dealing with a beehive that's attached to the ground with clay, then everyone agrees it is like land. So this is going to be based on the premise that anything attached to the ground is considered like the ground. That's going to be in Shavuot 6:6. Rosh Cirilio says, apparently our Gemara is maintaining that this principle applies even to something that at one point was not attached to the ground, and then later on became attached to the ground. So whether a detached item has become attached is considered connected to the ground is actually the subject of discussion in a lot of the places in the Gemara. Bavli Hulin 15b is one such place. So everyone agrees that if you're going and you're attaching the beehive to the ground with clay, everybody agrees it's going to be like land. So it's going to continue. It's going to say, if it is placed upon two stakes, everyone agrees that it is not like land. So this is going to be a case where even Rabbi Eliezer is going to agree. And in fact, Rabbi Eliezer is going to even concede that in this case, where the hive is suspended in the air, it's not at all like a forest. And so the scriptural composition does not apply. And, there's no basis here for considering it like the ground based on it not being attached to the ground. So that's also an interesting chiddush. So what case are they actually going to be talking about? So the Gemara is going to continue to say, rather, what is the case where we're dealing with, which is the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the sages? This is the case where it is resting on the ground without being attached to it. So Rabbi Eliezer is holding that this case is derived from the scriptural comparison between honey and forest, and the sages are going to dispute that explanation. And in fact, the disagreement here is actually quite narrow. The only disagreement here is going to be whether it's resting on the ground. If the case is suspended from the ground, Rabbi Eliezer even concedes it's not like land, because it's not like the forest. And if it's attached by clay to the ground, everyone, even the rabbis, the sages, agree that it is like land. They would agree with Rabbi Eliezer. The case in question here is going to be whether it's resting on the ground. So the Gemara is going to relate another ruling to this one, and it emerges like the following ruling with Rabbi Zera, where he said in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, we may write a Prozbul based upon the place of an oven, or based on the place of a kirya. Kirya is going to be a type of stove that's open on the top, and you can put on at least 2 pots. So this, by the way, is different from a tanur. Tanur is a type of oven that is going to be very narrow at top and very wide at the bottom. And so what this is saying, if the borrower was lent a place where he has an oven or a kira, then the Prozbul could be written on the basis of the borrowed land. And it may not, however, be written based on the oven itself resting on the land. So similarly, we view that of the sages, that a Prozbul may not be written on the basis of the beehive alone. So if you have like an oven that's built into place, these are big clay ovens or stone ovens, they're basically going to be saying that, well, it's basically built into the land. And so it's going to be substantial enough where you could write a Prozbul in the oven because it's affixed to the land. And the case over here is not going to be the same as if the oven is resting on the ground. Similarly, the sages are saying that a Prozbul may not be written on the basis of a beehive alone. So if you just have an oven that's a smaller kind of oven that's not fixed into the ground, it's actually just sitting there, that's not going to be enough. It actually has to be implanted into the ground, like somehow cemented in and built into the ground. That's what they're talking about. The Gemara is going to talk about a related ruling, and Rabbi Chia Barba says a Prozbul may be even written based on the place of a lamp. That's a surprising kiddush. So if you have a debtor who borrowed or rented a place where he was resting a lamp, he is considered to have real property eligible for a Prozbul. And despite the fact that only a small amount of land is needed for this purpose, it is generally only needed on a temporary basis. So that's what's surprising about it. So the Gemara is going to ask about this and say, with regards to removing bread from an oven on Shabbat, there would also be the same dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the sages. In other words, if you have an oven, it's placed in the ground without being attached with clay, they're asking, is Rabbi Eliezer going to hold someone who removes the bread liable to a chatas like someone who removes honey from a beehive? And the Gemara's question is based on the similarity between the honey and the bread. Bread, like honey, does not actually grow on its own in the place. And like the honey, which is, going to be, considered land because it's formed in the hive, the bread too is formed through baking in the oven, so it should be considered like land. So the Gemara is asking if the scriptural comparison between honey and a forest can be applied to the bread in the oven as well. Good question. So the Rabbi Eliezer, by the way, is basically going to be agreeing that one who takes bread out of the oven is not liable for detaching something from the place of growth. So what then is going to be the difference in Rabbi Eliezer's opinion about the bread and the honey? So the Gemara is going to give another ruling from the Mishnah, and the Gemara is going to the Gemara is going to differentiate the two. And it's going to say honey is considered the product of a beehive, but bread is not the product of an oven. So the oven, since an amount of honey is constantly being increased in a hive, it's going to be considered like a growing object. That's the idea. So somebody who removes honey from the hive on Shabbat is like uprooting a growing entity. That's the issue. But bread is going to be different because it's not a constantly growing entity. And that's going to be the source of the disagreement and the clarification that Rabbi Eliezer would give. So the Gemara is going to cite another ruling in the Mishnah and to say one who is repaying a debt that was subject to cancellation of Sheviis, the lender is to say to the borrower, I relinquish the debt. And the Gemara is going to elaborate. Rabbi Huna says that the lender may say, I relinquish the debt in a low tone and with his right hand outstretched to receive payment. So although the Torah prohibits accepting repayment of the loan, the lender is allowed to indicate that although he relinquishes the debt, he would like the borrower to agree to give him the money, like as a gift. So the Mishnah is going to conclude with a similar law regarding one who is killed accidentally. And they say, similarly, a killer who is exiled to a city of refuge and the townspeople wish to honor him should say to them, I am a killer. And the Gemara infers from this that Rabbi Yossi says this teaches that if a person who is proficient in one Masechet goes to a place where they honor him for knowing two Masechtot, he must tell them, I am knowledgeable only in one Masechet. And just as the killer must decline honor not due to him, so too one must decline honor based on a misperception of his true knowledge. So they're amazing. It's amazing that they're bringing in this this similarity of someone who killed accidentally, and they're trying to give him honor. He has to say to them at least once, "I'm a killer." He has to say his declare what he is. And over here, you're not allowed to take credit for knowledge that you don't really have. So, you have these people in life who are honor seekers, and you have to limit it. And you also have to say, you also have to decline. If somebody thinks that you are smarter than you are in Torah, you also have to decline honor. Then we're going to be getting into Halacha 4, which is going to be talking about the cancellation of debts and the repayment of debts, and how that's going to work. And we're going to get into some of the last sugyas are some of the most deep Agadic sugyas in the Yerushalmi. Halacha 4 is going to finish up chapter 10. So chapter 10, there are 10 chapters in Sheviis, and it should be noted that the Yerushalmi in Berachot says that the 7th bracha in the Shmona Esrei is because we have a tradition that the Gula is going to come in the 7th year. And we're going to be getting into that in Halacha 4. Have a great day.